Welcome to another episode of the Fascia Masters podcast. My name is Quinn Castellane, and I am joined, of course, with Deanna Hansen. And our topic today is going to be on inflammation. And there's two kinds of inflammation. So we have acute inflammation and we have chronic inflammation. And I feel like a lot of people have an extremely negative connotation towards inflammation in general, and it's bad. But we have a quite opposite perspective on it. And yes, certain types of inflammation can be harmful, but it's just realizing and knowing what to do with that inflammation to actually use it as a benefit rather than a con. So let's start off with general question. What is inflammation?
So inflammation is really just directed blood flow to a site that needs additional attention. So whether you've had an injury, whether you have a virus, a bacteria, a stress in the body, the inflammation is sent to areas where there needs to be cellular repair, because that's really what it's doing. It's just blood flow being directed to a site to create repair in order to create health and homeostasis again in the body.
Right. So let's start off by chatting about acute inflammation or acute injuries. So obviously acute inflammation comes from more so an acute injury. So perfect example is when I shattered my ankle. It knew that a major car accident just went on. I shattered it, and it needed to send all of this inflammation there pretty well as quick as it can to start to rebuild it. But there's an acronym called RICE, which is very, very popular. I forget who the doctor that coined the term RICE, but it's rest, ice, compression, elevation. And that's what I've been told. That's what you were told when you were in athletic therapy school.
Yes.
And why do you think or see that acronym might not actually be beneficial to recover an acute injury quickly?
So first of all, when we have any kind of damage in the body, the initial response is inflammation in order to rebuild. So if we ice it, for example, we're ignoring those signals and we're slowing down the process of healing by basically stopping that inflammation. And they teach us, or they taught us at least when I was in athletic therapy, that we should be icing for 48 to 72 hours after injury. But that's when the tissue needs the most energy. So for us to stop that in that time period, it creates a different way of the body healing as opposed to the potential for it to actually rebuild. So talking about your ankle, for example, like you didn't just have bone fractures, you had soft tissue damage. So that could be the ligaments, the tendons, the muscle fibers, the skin, the blood vessel, the nerve fibers, everything in that area that was damaged needs to be repaired. So the body knows what to do. And that's the really important thing to understand. We don't have to know all of the intricate details of the physiology because the body knows how to heal itself. We just have to support that process of healing. So if we ice that area for 48 to 72 hours, we have a gap in the system that hasn't been filled in through the process of rebuilding.
And that's just because the ice slows down that inflammation. So what do you mean by this gap?
So the second law of thermodynamics is nature abhors a gradient. So we've talked about this before, but when there's a gap in the system, nature is going to fill that gap in. If there's an earthquake and suddenly the earth shifts, all of the debris, the dirt, the earth gets piled into that space over time. So that's the nature of how everything in the universe deals with a gap in the system. So whether we're talking about a fracture in the bone, a tear or a rip in a tendon, a ligament, a muscle, whatever it is, that's a gap. So the first thing the body's going to do is say, okay, now we've got this gap. We want to send that inflammation so that we can actually rebuild all of the tissue that was damaged. And the body knows what to send. We don't have to know specifically all the details. The body knows what it's going to be directing all of the army to go and do this rebuilding. But we need to support that inflammation. And we do that through driving the fluids, keeping the body heated, adding energy to the system. As soon as we ice, it's like we're stopping the energy. So now if we do that and we apply the Rice method for 48 to 72 hours and we've really slowed down that ability for repair to happen, that gap is still going to get filled in. And it does so with the fabric of think of if you have like a whole bunch of eggs and you squish the eggs and all you have is the egg shell. So all the life of the egg, the yolk, the albumin, like whatever's in the egg, right? All of that stuff gets pulled away and now you have a bunch of eggshells. So that's kind of what gets filled into the gap, is a bunch of eggshells instead of a bunch of life. Like, a whole egg getting like rebuilt with the life inside. So we have the container, the fascia, the collagen, the support structure of the fascia is what ultimately gets sucked in, and it gets pulled in as in a vortex, like a black hole, because that's the way energy travels in waves and spirals. So now we've got this gap. If we don't rebuild it, we're getting, again, collagen. And that's going to, like if I, again, cut a piece out of my sweater, like literally cut a chunk out and sewed it up, now it's shorter. It actually changes the entire layout of the sweater. So when we heal with scar tissue in that way, we're actually changing the alignment of whatever has been affected. And then that scar tissue will block blood and oxygen flow, as well as the ability to remove toxins from cellular functioning away for the rest of your life on everything on the other side of that, because it becomes this barricade to flow. If, however, we support inflammation through understanding proper diaphragmatic breathing, because that's the body's way of moving the fluids really effectively to and from, and we also add in energy through a process of fascia decompression and putting attention into the actual injury site in a conscious way, then we utilize that inflammation and we create a rebuilding of the tissue. So it becomes a very different dynamic, and we can bring the body back to the state that it was before the injury happened, instead of having an injury and then forever being altered as a result of that.
Right. Yeah, I think what was really interesting is I believe his name was Dr. Merkin. He's the founder of the acronym RICE, and he actually came back in 2013 and said that resting in ice actually isn't beneficial or as beneficial for treating an injury, especially an acute injury. So that is what's really interesting, and I have a lot of respect for a doctor to do that. If they are saying, this is an acronym that you should be doing, this is the process you should be doing, and then they come back however many years later saying, you know what, this actually isn't the most effective way through all this research and treating a ton of different athletes or injuries. So that's what's really cool. So, okay, let's go through the process as if you were to sprain an ankle, because that is such a common injury. So I sprained it, and now there's inflammation and it's painful. I can hardly walk on it. I'm going to go to the couch just because I have to take pressure off. What is the first thing that I should be doing if I sprain an ankle?
The first thing that we should be doing is really making sure that that breath is strong, because pain, fear, and stress cause you to reactively hold the breath. So guaranteed, if you're in a lot of pain, your breath is going to be impaired. But that's when we need it the most, because that is going to be what's going to really turn on that healing within the body. So working through the rib cage, working through the abdomen, making sure that that breath is strong would be the very first thing. And in fact, I'm going to share what I did with my mom, your grandma, years ago when she came off the golf course. She actually came to my clinic and she had a second-degree ankle sprain, and very, very swollen, just off the golf course. So of course, okay, we'll go and put an ice pack on it. But I'm like, no, this is the first time I'm actually, because I had dealt with injury with my own body in the way that we share, but hadn't yet done it on somebody else. So then she came in, got her breath going, got her calmed down, got her breath regulated. Then I started working from the diaphragm down toward the site. So I worked through her hip flexor. We've got all of these roadways that we want to make sure are open. So I worked through the hip flexor all the way down through her leg, through her calf. And then already by the time I got to the ankle, this swelling had improved because we opened all these gates. So now we've got this basically car accident, the ankle injury. So as we're opening the flow and we're strengthening the breath, we're pulling away the debris from the injury to create the room so that the body can get everything to the space and start its rebuilding process. And then what I did with her ankle is I very gently started with applying just direct pressure. And of course, with her breath. So as long as she's breathing, she's feeding and healing the area. If I was doing something that hurt so much that it took that relaxed breath away, that is her body saying that's too much. Because as soon as the breath becomes compromised and we start holding the breath, now we don't have the movement of flow. So that's the key. So we never want to put the person into a state where they're so scared or they're in so much pain that they can't breathe in a relaxed way. So that's always the key. So by the time I got there, I started applying pressure. And I wasn't rubbing. I was literally just putting my fingers where the swelling was, where the injury was.
Directly where it was.
Well, and around, like just applying pressure to the area as she was allowing me. But the great part is the pressure fibers are larger in diameter than the pain fibers. So as soon as you go at a nice pace with their breath, those pressure fibers kick in, and then suddenly the pain signals, they start to diminish to some degree. So it wasn't very long before I was actually putting a lot more pressure in, and then I would have her very slowly within her own range move her ankle. So at first, she was tentative and scared, but then I said, like, not big movements, just nice tiny little movements. So got her moving it slightly while I'm adding pressure. Before you know it, she's able to move in a greater range of motion. We did that for a little while. And then I wanted to see what would happen if I were to have her actually put pressure into my hand. So I put my hand there and I said, I'm not going to move your foot. I want you to move your foot into my hand and hold as you breathe. So now I gave her the power to move that ankle and work that joint as her breath allowed. And again, it wasn't very long before she was actually putting quite a bit of pressure into my hand. So then from there, we moved to the floor, and I was holding her and helping her stabilize herself. And I said, okay, just very gently, put a little bit of weight onto that foot, only as your breath allows. We went through that process. Before long, we were actually allowing her to move back and forth, and then she was able to lift it up, and then we went through a process of getting her to walk. So this was a gradual process that maybe took a half an hour from the time she came in to when we had her actually walking. So sent her home that night. I let her know she's probably going to have quite a bit of pain, because when pain goes into the body, we want to pull it out. If we ice it, we kind of store it.
Yeah, you trap it in there.
Yeah, so we want to actually pull it out. So I let her know to expect that. I also let her know to expect that in the morning, it might look more swollen and it will be very painful until we get things moving. Because as we sleep, of course, the body's not moving as much and things start to settle. But I told her what to do in the morning. Again, go through this process of getting things moving. And then by the time I got there, she was 70% better. And within a couple of days, she really had no injury left to speak of. So this was a second-degree ankle injury that could have taken anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks to heal properly if, taking that normal RICE method and taking the typical approach as to what I was trained to do as an athletic therapist.
And what's so cool now with technology, TikTok, all the social platforms, YouTube, is we can show people how to do this at home. Because let's say I'm alone, or there's many people that just don't have that support, or somebody like you that conveniently to come over and address the injury. So what's great is I love that you explained the breath and then opening up the gateways of flow to that area so that we can actually take out the old inflammation and then bring in the new blood and oxygen to keep rebuilding. So I think on one of my TikToks, it's actually ended up doing very, very well and a lot of positive feedback, which again is like extremely cool that we can teach people this virtually and 500,000 people can see it. So that's what I find really, really cool. So all I taught them to do, I actually didn't even have, because TikTok, you can only say so much within a minute, really. And that's pretty well the duration. I told them to start doing the circles with the foot and the ankle. And then once you've done like about 10 rotations on each side, because this is like right when it happened. It's not a week or 2 weeks after it's happened. And then I told them to just be seated like this and then just slowly start applying pressure into that injured ankle. And while connecting your breath, hold that for 5 to 10 breaths or so while breathing diaphragmatically. And then I told them to very slowly, once they got comfortable, to do little calf raises while they're being seated. And then they can slowly accelerate to doing a little bit more and actually standing and doing so. And then I had a part 2 version, which was actually showing fascia decompression techniques with the towel, so block therapy with the towel, and in kind of all surrounding areas. And it's amazing what that probably totaling 2 minutes of footage and explanation has helped so many people. So that's what's really cool with this theory, is that it's not overly complicated. It's very simple. It's just listen, like we're just assisting the body in what it's supposed to do.
And to be clear, I'm not suggesting to not go and get it checked out by a doctor, right? But sometimes you might not have access to getting to a doctor right away or even at all, depending on, like, if you're walking. In fact, I was with my guy once, and we were walking on a trail, and he goes over on his ankle, and, you know, in his mind, he's like, oh my gosh, like, now what do I do? And I said, oh, just, you know, give me 10 minutes. And we got him walking again. So this isn't to take away the medical. However, we don't always have access to the medical.
If you don't know if you like broke your ankle or something,
Right.
obviously go get it checked out.
Yes.
But there's also a lot of people who just have extremely slow recoveries of any kind of injury. So it could be 4 weeks down the line, and there's still a ton of inflammation in their ankle. It's still painful, not great mobility, etc. So
And the difference there too is if you have a body that is riddled with adhesions all throughout, your healing, and you also don't have a conscious breath, your healing rate will be way slower than if you have open channels. And that's why we go through this process of making sure that the breath is strong and opening the channels before we actually go and target that site. So even if you're really afraid and think, oh my gosh, I can't get in to see a doctor until tomorrow, I'm not really sure if I broke my ankle, you can still do the breath work, and you can still open the channels through applying some of those fascia decompression techniques, even just having a towel under the hamstring, the back of the knee, under the calf. As you're focused on the breathing, start with the breath first. Right. You know, that in itself, that's going to, again, support the inflammatory process so that you can just get a start on the healing. And then again, depending on the level of what needs to happen based on the injury, then you go from there.
Absolutely. This is actually a funny story. So this actually wasn't me, because I know you and I explained some stories in our previous podcasts. But this was probably 5 years ago or so. This is when I was in the apartment, and then I had a buddy over, and we were going to just kind of, it was probably a Friday night, go out and walk through Osborne, and we had to like hop over this like high curb, like a big step, and it was dark out, and where he landed on a or like on a tree stump or something, and completely rolled his ankle, like really bad. And he's on the floor, he's like, I just broke my ankle. And I'm like, let's see about that. So in the moment, I'm like, okay, buddy, stand up. And he's like, no, man, like we should call somebody to like pick me up. Like, I can't walk on this. I'm like, no, you can. Like, then I explained the whole process behind this, and he's like, I need to ice it, I need to do this. And I'm like, no, you don't. Try this out. So we were probably we were right at Confusion Corner, 10-15 minute walk away or so. Well, the way that he was, still a ways. So I had him very slowly starting to apply pressure. I was kind of standing in front of him, holding him, and I'm like, okay, as you exhale, slowly apply pressure. And he's like stumbling on it, like, it hurts. I'm like, okay, keep breathing, let's just apply pressure. So after doing that for a minute, that's it, he was able to walk back home with me. And he's like, Quinn, if I got that checked out and did the whole rice technique and put a brace around it, I know that would have taken probably 4 to 6 weeks to heal. I think he might have even like chipped it or something. He said he was totally fine within like a week.
And one of the
That's
things,
crazy.
It is crazy. And one of the things that we need to understand is the body wants to be right. Like, there's magnetics involved. If we have a bone, the bone knows where home is for each part of the bone. So if you break that bone and you apply what is necessary with this fluid matrix that our body is, that bone is going to come back together and it's going to repair. When we look at the body in its parts and then think of, okay, like I've just broken this bone, like you've snapped a twig. If you look at it that way, it can really mess with your mind, because you're thinking, well, if I'm moving this and I've got this thing going, like, how is it ever going to find its way back?
Right.
But the body wants to be healed. What can often happen when we go and we have a cast and we don't have any mobility for 4 weeks, and I see this a lot in wrists, when people fracture their wrists and they get casted, the bones don't heal right because you're not putting the energy into the space, and now they're fusing together in some random manipulation. And then, I mean, that happens in other things, and then they have to go and re-break things because they heal wrong. If the body maintains its fluidity, it finds its way back home, because that's where it's supposed to be.
And you're saying that's more so through magnetics?
Well, yeah, because the body is electromagnetic, so the cells want to be together. Like it's like family units. Like we know who our family is, right? Like there's a sense of family, and the cells have that sense of family. So that's the beauty and the intelligence of the body, is the body wants to be aligned and healthy. We're born to be this way, and when we understand how to address the fascia system, because again, this is the container of everything in the body, then we support the fascia in the most healthful way and keep those cells repairing very quickly. And it's a very different approach than, again, looking at the parts of the body and seeing everything as a separation. There's nothing separate in here. It just looks like that when we look at pictures.
Very cool. No, that's a great explanation. So now let's say I did the rice technique, and and it's been 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 3 months, and I still feel inflammation in my ankle. So would that be considered chronic inflammation, or is that just acute? What determines chronic inflammation?
Well, when it basically isn't doing its job and going away and repairing. So the thing is, when people apply the rice technique, it's not just the icing. We're also told to not put any weight on it, right? So like whether you're in a cast, stay off the leg for 2 to 4 weeks, you're walking on crutches. Now your entire body becomes manipulated through incorrect mechanics. So you develop more and more and more adhesions, and then anytime you have less flow, those adhesions build up really rapidly. So by time you actually would get that cast off, or you get rid of those crutches and you try walking, now your entire gait is off. The fascia, the way it has manipulated and moved as a result of your incorrect mechanics, have just basically glued and adhered to the bone, and that's a major barricade to blood flow. So now you've got this ankle that is, kind of puffy and ballooned because there's no ability for the damage to move away from the site, or to let that new healing come into the site, because you've basically got an entire frozen limb. So that can take a very long time, and it might stay a chronic issue lifelong because of that if you don't get the proper treatment. And at that point, the treatment would be different than if you addressed it initially in the correct way.
Crazy. So then chronic inflammation, they're saying, is, and I'm not talking about like from an acute injury, just chronic inflammation anywhere within the body, typically in the gut. I remember we looked at those thermography photos from Tammy, which were incredible. And I had nothing to do with that process, so I'll let you speak on this. But so when it comes to that kind of chronic inflammation, so that could be from eating foods that feed pathogens, and that can start creating that inflammation. And then if you're continually having a very poor diet, then your body can't cleanse itself properly, because you're probably also not breathing properly. You're not optimizing the flow throughout the entire body, so it just gets stuck and stagnant. So chronic inflammation, what are the ways that cause chronic inflammation other than, let's say, pathogens?
Well, actually, in my view, and I'm always going to come down to this, like in the simplified version, chronic inflammation occurs when we're not conscious breathers, because inflammation is, again, directed blood flow, and we need energy to move it. Just like starting the car. If you don't get that car and put your foot on the gas pedal, your car sits there, but it's not moving anywhere because there's no energy. You need gas in the car. You need to have a person driving the car. Like, you need activity and energy in order for that to move. So that's what the breath does. It's like the motor of the body, or the inboard motor of a boat, compared to the trolling motor when we breathe through the muscles of the upper chest. You're not going to take a boat and drive 100 miles with a trolling motor. You're going to use that to go fishing and putt around and go nice and slow. But if we want to actually get our body moving and be full of energy, which, especially if we're having to repair, we need that energy, you want that motor to be working on your behalf. So when that motor doesn't work properly, our body becomes colder, and flow slows when it's cold. Just like the river in Winnipeg in January. There's still flow under the surface, but it's a very different flow than the river in July in Winnipeg because of the temperature. So the breath dictates the body's internal temperature. When we're breathing diaphragmatically, we are fueling the body with heat, with energy, with movement. So repair is fast. Inflammation doesn't settle anywhere because there's movement. Think of the city when there's rush hour compared to, you know, going for a nice cruise on a Sunday when there's hardly any traffic and there's no construction. You know, there's ease of flow. So you can go into a mall, you can find a parking spot really easy, you can go in, you can come out, there's no obstruction. Mm-hmm. Now think of trying to do that same thing when it's December 20th in Winnipeg and it's rush hour and everybody's going to the mall because, you know, like everybody has to get Christmas presents and there's a blizzard going on and there's like, you know, sections of roads blocked off. You have absolute chaos. Nothing happens fast. Nothing gets done. The potential for more damage, more injury, more problems is there because of the situation. It's cold, there's congestion, there's just too much happening. So when the body doesn't have proper breath, it becomes like that. You know, without the proper breath, there's going to be a lot of areas of chronic inflammation because incorrect breathing creates adhesions in the body riddled throughout. So the whole body is going to be saying, I'm not getting what I need. So there's always going to be that blood in the body's mind being sent to these cells because there's going to be repair, but it's never going to get there. So the body is under this constant state of inflaming to the point, and this is where adrenal fatigue comes in, right? To the point where it's just so slow and it can't go anywhere that we become so stuck and congested, and when inflammation becomes stagnant, it becomes acidic. Just like in a river, if you put a beaver dam and then you've got areas where there's no flow, algae grows. Algae is not going to grow where there's good flow. It's going to grow where there's a lack of flow. And then what's that going to attract? That's going to attract very different microorganisms, things, than if there's flow, because the flow keeps things clean. So that's the thing. We become dirty, we become toxic, and then we attract other things that aren't supposed to be in us that also create waste. We become even more toxic, we expand, and then we just become this really slow, frozen, moving body that really has inflammation everywhere. And in that thermography image, it was lovely because we saw the body before blocking. And there was a ton, when you look at a thermography image where you see the red and the white, and maybe we can even share a picture of this.
I was just looking at this before our episode.
Yeah, so you could see a ton of red and white right around the diaphragm. So this is the gut, right? So there's no breath here. You've got all of these organs that have tons of jobs to do for our health.
And slight pause just so that if people are just watching this for the first time, the diaphragm resides just above your abdominal organs, just below the heart and the lungs.
Yeah.
So if that diaphragm is turned off and you're not using it and you're breathing through the muscles in the upper chest, then it's not moving and helping with that inflammation.
Exactly. Like let's even just talk for a second about digestion. Okay, so here's the stomach organ right below that left breast for women, the left pec. So when we're eating, if we don't chew our food to become liquid, so we're swallowing bits of food whole, and we've collapsed in our body, displacing that organ, and we're not breathing, now we're putting whole parts of food in the stomach with no energy to break it down. So that creates gut issues. You know, now the gut is exhausted, you might get leaky gut. Either way, that's going to create inflammation because the body's saying, well, wait a sec, you're needing to digest, but you don't have the energy to do that, so we're going to go and send some help. Conversely, if we chew our food to liquid, we swallow it, and then we are breathing diaphragmatically, that action of breathing is going to create that massage for that organ to give that that organ additional energy to actually break down the food and then go through the absorption and eliminatory process. But if we don't have that, again, the body has to do its job, but it doesn't have the energy to do that, so it starts to send more blood flow. But if we're not breathing, then it just becomes stagnant and chronic, and more gets sent, and then we're just riddled with inflammation. And then that's going to play on every part of the body.
Right. Yeah, that's crazy. So then what did that lady follow to rid that inflammation so fast? Because I really want these people to see these before and afters because they're incredible. And if you're listening to this on Spotify, then just check out our website, and if you type in the search bar just inflammation, you'll be able to see one of the blogs, and then those photos are put in there. It's incredible to see because I don't think Tammy has ever seen anything like that before.
Yeah, so the woman, is in New York and does thermography. That's part of her living. So she did a before photo of a person who started block therapy, and then 2 months after. And she had just did the starter program in the process of block therapy. I don't know the specific program she did, but it was just 2 months of blocking.
Yep.
And then she took the thermography image afterward, and you can see in this area it's now blue and green. There's still a little bit of red in here.
Incredible to see that.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it.
And Tammy had mentioned that she has never seen an image or inflammation so quickly moved out of the body. And it was simply, and again, like this woman didn't go and, go crazy in blocking. She just basically did the basic program. And it was getting that movement because that's what created the heating. So inflammation has potential energy, because that's what it's sending. It's sending energy with whatever requirements are needed to rebuild an area. But if the energy isn't utilized, it stays in that frozen state. I remember going to the lake a number of times in the winter, and you'd walk in and it's, winter time, you'd turn on the heat, and then suddenly there's flies everywhere. And you're thinking, where did these flies come from? So they weren't dead. They were in hibernation. They were dormant. You turn up that heat, suddenly they come to life. So in the inflammation where it's chronic, basically all of that healing potential is dormant. So then we start turning up the heat by activating proper diaphragmatic breathing, and all of that healing potential comes to life, and it can start that repair process. So that's what is really exciting, because again, people believe, and it's true, that chronic inflammation can create bad things, dementia, deterioration of pretty much anything and everything in its pathway.
Yeah, there's a lot of doctors that will pretty well say chronic inflammation is the cause of nearly all chronic issues within the body.
And it can, but it doesn't have to.
Right.
And if we know what to do with it, it actually becomes the healing power of the body, because we turn on all of that healing potential, all of that potential energy. It's just, it all comes down to tissue temperature, which is all driven by the breath.
So another big topic nowadays is like a cold plunge. And so this is interesting because I like chatting about this a bit, and I think I got this from the Huberman podcast. He's a brilliant guy. And so, for example, just to take a step back, when I was bodybuilding, and I still weight train a decent amount, but when I was bodybuilding, what we're actually doing in order to create more muscle, to build more muscle, is to create micro tears within the muscle cell and the fibers, so that it triggers the immune response to send inflammation to actually rebuild those cells to be bigger and stronger. So the body knows to trigger the immune system to send that inflammation to repair it. But if we don't treat an injury properly, because going to the gym and tearing up your body in the gym is technically micro injuries within the body, wherever you worked out, essentially, right? So if we're not treating that injury properly, then that can actually develop more scar tissue. So what I really liked what he said, he was talking about cold plunges, and a lot of athletes are asking, hey, should I be doing a cold plunge after I work out? Because my body's like all hot, it's like full of inflammation. What should I do? And he's like, no, that's actually the worst time to do it. You want your body to have that inflammation to be sent to rebuild and do its job properly. So this is another good example that inflammation is actually a very good thing in that instance. So he was recommending, and he's an advocate of cold plunges. I personally am too. I like them at the right time and place. Like there's proven to be a lot of benefits, but he says pretty well first thing in the morning. Some people say before you train. I wouldn't agree with that, because we want your body to be more so warm before you train. But he also says, hey, do a sauna after you work out. That's great. That will only assist the body with that inflammation, with providing more blood and oxygen flow throughout the entire body to actually repair it properly. So I love how that how he mentioned that, because that's such an important thing. So what do you think would be the best protocol after somebody were to do a bodybuilding workout? Let's say you wanted to work out your chest and your shoulders.
Again, it all comes down to flow. You want to make sure that the body is flowing as optimally as it can.
So stretching.
making sure your breath is strong. I mean, if you've been working out your legs or your chest, doing some fascia decompression there, because again, you are creating micro tears. So now, just like that acute injury, that ankle sprain, you want there to be energy to remove the debris and send in the repair process. So working in those spaces with either the block or fascia decompression with a towel. But again, it comes down to the breath. So that is always the key, because we can put a block or a towel under our calf, but if we're breathing really shallow, we're really not moving that fluid effectively. So it's the magic when you combine the pressure over time on the outside combined with diaphragmatic breathing on the inside. You're turning on the body's furnace, adding pressure over time. Now you're getting heating from inside and outside, which is very effective at melting and keeping things as they should be.
Yeah. And not to get too off topic, but a lot of people ask us, when is the best time to block, to do fascia decompression, before or after you weight train? And I think for the purpose of, just stimulating more flow throughout the entire body, post-workout is great for that. It's really good for recovery. But if I had to choose between one or the other, I would actually say pre-workout. The reason why is because, as you mentioned, the body's riddled with adhesions everywhere. And you want to create as much release and then memory within the fascia before you work out. So if I'm at a desk all day long, working, slouched over, and my head's pointing forward, now I'm trying to work out my back. Now I'm working it out in this totally incorrect alignment. But if I reset my posture, my alignment, I know within my body where the major collapses or adhesions are. I'm going to address those. And then I'm going to go to the gym, do some warm-ups to make sure that the certain and the right muscles are firing before I were to do, let's just say, a bodybuilding workout. So I just wanted to mention that because a lot of people ask that question.
Tons of people do. And what's interesting is, like, as you said, like if you've been like this all day and you go and you start pumping like this, now we're not bringing integration of the cells that would be activated if we open things up before we do the work. So what was so great with you when we started was when you were 18 years old, you were a bodybuilder and you were big and thick. And then when we started the process and you started working your body, there was such a change in your alignment and the integration of cells that you were using to strengthen. So if I'm only activating 20% of my cells and I want to get really big, I'm making that 20% expand as much as they can. And you often see in bodybuilders, they've got those stretch marks here.
Yeah.
And that's because of that, where if we have proper alignment and full integration, now we're getting 100% of those cells to be part of the equation for strengthening, as opposed to trying to balloon and stimulate and overgrow the cells that are only available, because that's going to create micro tears that are going to down the road be really problematic. Same as breathing. Like there's some people that will talk about, like if you focus on breathing too much, too deeply, it can create problems. It only, in my view, creates problems if you're not connected to that proper exhalation and you don't have that ability to release the adhesions here, because now you're pulling way more into the lungs. And again, like if you blow up a balloon a whole bunch of times, you can see those stretch marks in the balloon, right? So that can create problems. We want the integrity of the cell membranes to be maintained. And that comes through keeping cells aligned, which means optimal space. Then there's an ease of flow in and an ease of removal of waste out. That's the key. As soon as there's compression, now we have less surface area for those cells to absorb nutrients and to rid the body. So that kind of a body is going to be very sore after a workout, because now you have the inability to move all of the waste from the activity. Like a car has exhaust, our cells have exhaust or waste with activity, right? So if we don't have that ability to pull it away through the space, then it becomes, again, like we've got that inflammation settling and we've got that feeling of that lactic acid. It's acid, right?
Yeah.
It becomes acidic and then we feel it and we become sore. So as long as there's flow, we don't have to go through that process. You had mentioned cold plunges though, and we never really talked about them.
Right. Yeah, so what he mentioned and what a lot of people that are pro cold plunge or cold water therapy or whatever it's really called. It's a lot of them say it helps with inflammation. It also releases the specific cold shock protein, I believe it's called, from the liver, which is integral for repairing the body. I don't know all the science behind this, so I don't want anybody to quote me on this, but there's a ton of benefits. And I actually just ordered one the other day. I got a really inexpensive one because they can go up to like $10,000. And I'm like, okay, I got to make sure I actually like this thing before I invest into a decent one. So I remember when I first asked you your thoughts on cold therapy, and even now, like what is really your opinion all in all when it comes to either a cold shower or a cold plunge?
I think they're hugely beneficial because it's shocking the body. So, whenever the body is stressed, if it's healthy, it's going to go through a process to bring itself back to balance. So when we're cold, we shiver. That's turning on the body. When we're hot, we sweat. A cold plunge of the whole body, in my view, is extremely different than spot icing for an injury, because then we're taking this heated body and we're freezing a certain area where it needs the most amount of energy, as opposed to, you're putting the whole body. I mean, like, we live in Winnipeg, so if you go outside and you go for a walk and it's cold, like, you might be shivering, but that's your body turning on its ability to self-regulate the temperature. So I see that as good because, again, like, I'm not particularly fond of it personally, but
they suck. Nobody likes doing them.
But I did go to Thermea and I went through that cold, and yeah, you know what? On the other side, you feel amazing.
You really do.
You really do.
Your whole body's vibrating, tingling.
Yeah.
You feel like one of the biggest things I notice is if I feel stressed or anxious, it just kind of dissipates that. I'm like, why was I even stressed or anxious? Like, your body feels good. My brain works really well because you also just shock your brain too. Your brain just went through like a bit of a panic mode here. Yeah. And you have to start, now you allow your body to use its energy to heat itself back up. And you just feel really, really good. But
and there's no question that for us to be strong, we have to push our limits. If we're always living in, this much room, this is all we have the capacity for. So if we want to become stronger, we can't just live in what we can normally do now. We've got to push ourselves, and we've got to experience that in order to make gains. Yeah. So that's just another way for the body to go there. If you're always living in 20 degrees Celsius and you never experience anything else, like when people come to Canada and they're not used to the cold, it's really shocking to them. If you're in the middle of winter and you're Canadian and you're used to it, it's not a shock anymore because our system has become regulated for it. So the more you can push your limits within the degree that makes sense, then you can make your body stronger. Same as a plant in the wind. I mean, if it's having to fight the wind all the time, it's going to become stronger in its structure to be able to counterbalance those forces. Yeah. If there's no forces on anything, same as raised, like, everything in the universe is a mirror itself. Like, raised children, if you keep them so comforted and locked in a scenario where they never have to push themselves or feel afraid or, do anything that goes outside of what's comfortable, then they're not going to become very resilient, because we have to learn through suffering a little bit. And the body will also become stronger through that kind of mindset where you got to push it a little bit. But you want to move toward the fence, and we all learn. Sometimes we injure ourselves when we push ourselves too hard. And that's just learning. That's the human condition. But there is also the body's ability to reset itself if we do injure ourselves, and we know what to do to support inflammation. Then we don't have to throw ourselves into some chronic episode of deterioration, which will dictate how we age.
Right. Wow. So we covered a ton on this episode. Just kind of as like a recap, we talked a lot about acute injuries and how to actually treat an acute injury. We gave the example of a sprained ankle. And then we talked about kind of how to treat an injury if it's been stagnant for a really long time. And we didn't necessarily give like a full protocol.
Yeah, but let's just sort of touch on that, because if you have had an injury and you did go through the traditional route of the Rice method, and you were on crutches and your whole body became affected as a result of that, the beautiful part about fascia decompression is we can still get to that injury and repair that scar tissue and create that ability. There's 4 stages to tissue freeze. So stage 1 is healthy tissue that's spacious with optimal flow. Stage 2 is an injury where you create a barricade, a barrier, whatever it is that creates that. And that is acute inflammation. Stage 3, if that's not addressed properly, becomes chronic inflammation, where again, there's a lack of flow. Now the body's still saying, okay, we still need to repair. It's still sending more blood flow, but it's not moving. So now it gets built up, and then you just got this swollen area of lymph and all this stuff. Stage 4 is, okay, there's like very little life. It's like that hibernating tissue.
Right.
So when we start fascia decompression.
Would that be considered scar tissue?
Yes.
Or just prior to scar tissue?
Adhesions riddled throughout, and the way that the fascia will grip and lock. So like you can see that a lot in the calves and the feet because again, it's so far from that engine. So we can go from stage 4 back to stage 3, back to stage 2, back to stage 1. And that will happen with this process. So you've got people blocking, for example, and they start warming the body, they start doing the practice, and then suddenly, wow, okay, well, my knee hurts. Okay, well, how long ago did you have some kind of potential injury in the knee? So that can become inflamed for a while, and then boom, something shifts because you keep adding energy to it, and then you're going from that chronic state back to the acute state. And that often happens, and that's a good thing because you're pulling that injury back up to the surface so that you can actually heal it the way we should have healed it in the first place to get to stage 1, which is healthy, spacious tissue. So we have that ability to move between stage 1 and stage 4. Similarly, we have that ability to go from young, healthy tissue to aging to reversing it back.
Right.
And again, it's not about looking 20 when you're 50. It's about keeping those cells where they're supposed to be so that they have life and flow. So that's the interesting part, is we can go through these stages of injury and bring up that acute injury again so that we can actually deal with it years later and actually go back to stage 1, which is healthy tissue.
Yeah. No, that's great that we covered that because we talked about how to treat it as if you just injured yourself in that moment. Now, a prolonged recovery period with some stagnant inflammation. And really that comes down to like what you just mentioned. So start off with the breath and start really working fascia decompression, block therapy all throughout that area, but also opening up the gates of flow to actually allow it to get there and then pump it out. Then of course doing certain movements and exercises just to assist with that process. Then we talked about chronic inflammation and how simply doing block therapy, fascia decompression, and optimizing the diaphragmatic breath, how big of a change that did for that one lady that Tammy showcased with the thermography. And then cold plunges, and then gyms, and what happens to the body. So we talked about a lot.
And one other thing just to make mention of, because again, living in this city, we get to see the freeze and the thaw every single year. And I watch the patterns and I apply that to what's going on in the body. So when it's springtime and you're seeing all of these snowbanks that are filled with dirt as well, for example, as things thaw, it's the dirty snow that is the slowest to melt. It's not the clean snow.
Yeah.
So
That's
if our
true.
body is full of toxins and we have chronic inflammation, that's another thing to understand is you start this process, if you've had ton of chemical medications and you don't eat a clean diet and all these things in your body, it's going to take longer to get that inflammation to move out of the way. And that's where sometimes having those additional cleanses are really, really helpful because it helps pull some of that mess out of the way as you're going through the process of heating up. So we are a wonderful, complex, beautiful system. And it really is simple when you look at it from the perspective of moving fluids, adhesions, and proper cell alignment. But it can become really complicated when you get caught up in the, first of all, if you're not well and you're trying to understand your body, that can be a challenge. But also when you're getting caught up in the specifics of all these different things in these different parts, especially the language. I mean, like there's so many names for things that are it's crazy. So bringing the body down to the simplistic function of the fascia and what we need to do to keep our cells aligned. If we can look at it that way, then we can approach pretty much anything from that perspective.
So it is so true. Like it makes you question, why are all of these terms so complex? Like still, like, I don't know half of them. And I honestly don't even really want to know half of them, because we just view the body as a completely simplistic way of healing. Because you mentioned this, the body knows what it needs to do. We don't have to consciously think, oh, send blood to my liver and do this to help detoxify it. It's already trying to do that. Just allow it to do that by assisting it with the breath, with proper blood and oxygen flow, with a clean, I like how you said clean diet, because a clean diet can really mean any diet as long as it's not full of crap.
Yeah.
And stay hydrated, and you're going to do pretty good. Keep moving. And
honestly, I think one of the reasons, or maybe even the main reason, is because if we don't understand the language, we don't understand our own bodies, and then we have to look out here for the answers. And then we get thrown into the system, where if we really understand our own body and how to heal ourselves, then all of that is far less necessary.
Totally.
Medical is so valuable. If there's a car accident, if you break yourself and you need immediate attention, there is nothing better. And in Canada, we are so lucky with our medical system, but medical should not be looked at for prevention or to be healthy.
Yeah.
It is not meant for that. We have to take responsibility. If you are not looking after your body and you go to the doctor and you want them to fix you, you're going to not succeed, because they can't ensure that your posture is correct. They can't ensure that you're diaphragmatically breathing. And without both of those things, you are under gravity's influence, and that will dictate how you age. Combine that with the toxins in the world, the inability to detoxify our own bodies, we will be riddled with disease, and we will age in a manner that is not under our control. Now, there's lots of things we can't control, but we have a ton of things that we can control. And if we do, again, we don't have to look outward so much. The body will let us know, and it will look after itself.
Totally. Yeah, so if anybody is really looking to improve their overall health, if you have chronic inflammation, a great place to start is we have our sampler program, which is like I almost said free, but it's $9. It's inexpensive. You can even check out a lot of our positions on our YouTube at Block Therapy. I show a lot on mine as well. And then really, if you want the real deal, it's the starter package, and that's going to do absolute wonders for you. That's what Tammy's client did to reduce significantly that chronic inflammation. And reach out to us if you want to join our Facebook community group. Just go to Facebook, type in Block Therapy Community, and just request access, and we'll let you in. And there's a ton of information in there. You can ask any questions you want. And that's pretty well the process. So hope everybody found this informative, and this was a lot of fun.
That was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
Thanks.
this is a good conversation to have, because there's a lot of controversy around inflammation and how to deal and treat it. And this has only shown success. So thank you very much for explaining your wisdom and sharing that with all of us. And we'll see everyone in the next episode.